So welcome everybody to the Greene County Well Water Monitoring and Education Program. My name is Kevin Masarik. I work for University of Wisconsin Extension, and I'll be the one that goes through the results, but also provides a little bit of background on groundwater and where your well water comes from. Just a broad overview of the areas that we focused in on. Obviously, this is a program offered by Greene County Extension, but more specifically, we focused on the towns of York, New Glarus, Adams, and Washington. There might be a few people from outside that region, but that's the focal point is the upper northwest quadrant of Greene County. So pay attention to this map, get a sense for where you're located. We see the village or the city of New Glarus. We see some delineations for the town boundaries, some of the major highways. We won't display anybody's results at a site-specific level, but we will display some maps helping people understand variability in well water quality from this area. And just to give you a sense for where the samples came from, what you're seeing here is a map. Every basically quarter section that we received a sample, you'll see a number. Most of the time you'll see a number 1, but in some cases you might see a 2, 3. There's even a number 5 on display, and that just means we received multiple samples from the same that same aggregated area. In the case of multiple samples, we would display the average concentration rather than the individual well concentration, but a pretty good broad distribution of samples across the 4-town area, with maybe a little bit more sample density around the city of New Glarus, which isn't surprising because there's likely more homes in that area. But these samples, by sampling as a large group or as a community like you have, we get kind of a snapshot in time of groundwater quality, which helps us better understand where there might be issues or problems, or just helps us characterize groundwater quality more generally for various aesthetic related concerns. So in the time we have together today, what we'd like to do and cover with you is just a little bit about groundwater basics. We'll talk about well construction and how that might be impacting your well water quality. Individual test results and what they mean is probably the main reason why you've joined us tonight. And then again, because we've tested as a large group, we want to give people the opportunity to learn more about groundwater quality more generally in the county. And then lastly, as Victoria stated, I'll stick around on the line after the official program ends to answer any questions people have about maybe improving well water quality if your results indicated an issue or a problem. So just to get everybody on the same page, groundwater is where your well water comes from. And there's a lot of misconceptions about groundwater because it's a resource that we can't necessarily see. It occurs below the ground, and that's really what our wells are accessing when they bring water into our homes. But just so that people are aware, groundwater is not an underground lake. It's not an underground river. It's just the water that occupies the empty space either in the soil or in the cracks in the rock beneath the land surface. And our groundwater basically originates as rainwater or snowmelt. It's not glacial water. It's not water coming from Canada or Lake Superior. It's just rain or snowmelt that recharges or infiltrates down into the ground fairly locally, eventually reaching a point where all the empty spaces in the cracks or all the pore spaces in between the soil are filled with water. And that's our groundwater, and that's what wells are tapping into to bring water into our homes. The other thing to point out about groundwater is that it's always moving very slowly through the pore spaces or the cracks in the rock. And it's moving towards what we call discharge features. Those discharge features are going to be nearby lakes, rivers, streams, or wetlands. So we can use that information sometimes to get a better understanding of where somebody's well water might be originating or coming from. And in a lot of cases, most people's well water if we want to understand where that water infiltrated down into the ground, we could probably draw a quarter or a half-mile circle around the well and have a pretty good sense of the major land uses that are responsible for someone's water quality. Some things we'll talk about are the various influences on water quality. Some of those influences might be related to land use. Other things might be related to the types of rocks or minerals that water is moving through. And we'll try to help people distinguish those characteristics a little bit better as we move through the program. We mentioned, rocks or soil that store or hold our groundwater, and the fancy name we give to that is called an aquifer. That's just a water-bearing geologic formation, and Wisconsin has this layered cake geology. So different layers of geologic materials that were deposited over the last 4 billion years or so. Many of them, much more recently in the last maybe 100,000 to 1 million years, are a lot of times the things that we're relying on for our groundwater. But this layered cake geology gives us a better understanding of the types of rocks or aquifers where we might be accessing or pulling our water from. Some of those aquifer properties are really important for determining things like how quickly the groundwater moves, or maybe how easily that groundwater becomes contaminated. So if we think of water moving through the tiny spaces in between sand acts as a pretty good filter, being able to filter out things like bacteria. Whereas water moving through large cracks or fractures, in let's say limestone or maybe dolomite rock, isn't going to benefit as much from that filtering ability of the media that it's moving through. So the type of aquifers, the types of geologic material that occur near our well are really important for determining, again, how easily our groundwater or our well water might become contaminated. And if we look specifically at Greene County geology, what you're seeing on the right is a very generalized map of Greene County bedrock geology. So if we scraped away all the unconsolidated materials, those would be materials that were left behind by the glaciers, things like sands and gravels, or maybe windblown silt that was deposited over the last 50,000 years or so. This is showing us what type of bedrock we might encounter. And the areas in the dark orange would be what we call carbonate rock. Carbonate rocks are limestones that tend to be highly cracked or fractured. And then those areas in the lighter orange or yellow are areas where we would encounter sandstone. And sandstone is just cemented sand grains, and the way in which water moves between those two different types of aquifer materials is really quite different. We would assume that those areas in the darker orange or the carbonate rock tend to be a little bit more susceptible to land use activities just because of the aquifer, the geologic properties that occur in those areas. When we talk about water quality, which is what we're going to transition into next, we call water the universal solvent because it naturally wants to dissolve stuff. So as much as we all want pure H2O, in the environment, in the groundwater system, we have to be aware that we're never going to find pure water in the ground or in our aquifers. Our groundwater is naturally going to have stuff dissolved in it. Again, depending on the types of rocks or minerals that water flows through, the types of land use where that water infiltrates into the ground, even the types of plumbing or packaging that water is stored or transported in can impart different impurities. So things like lead or copper oftentimes are going to be related to the plumbing system, not necessarily the rocks or soils that water is moving through. And throughout the program, we'll help people understand a little bit about the dominant or the driving factors for some of the different tests that we run, helping people understand, is this something that came from naturally occurring rocks or soils? Or are these things that we would expect to be occurring as a result of land use? If you did find something objectionable or wrong based on the water quality results, just know that we can treat water to take those unwanted impurities or contaminants out. And we'll try to highlight what some of those options might be for folks as we go through the tests or the analytes that we tested for. When you're looking at your results, you might have only done the homeowner package. That's a series of seven or eight tests. You might have also added on the metals package, and some people may have even added on the DAX screen. That's a fairly extensive set of analyses, and you'll probably know more about your water than I'd say 95% of all well owners in the state of Wisconsin. It's a fairly comprehensive look at well water quality, looking for some of the more common problems that we would expect to find. Just know that not all those tests that were run are important to health. There are obviously a number of them in there that we do for health-related reasons, but there's a whole host of other tests that we offer because they tell us things about the taste, color, or maybe odor that people find objectionable. There's other tests that we run because it's useful for helping us understand how that water is going to interact with, let's say, your plumbing system. So as we go through this, I'll try to kind of point out those that are important to health. Oftentimes the ones or the impetus or the things that people have the most questions about aren't necessarily the health related ones, or the things related to taste, color, or odor. And the ones that are important to health are oftentimes things that we can't necessarily see, taste, or smell. And that's really why testing can be so critical or important. When we talk about health-related impacts from well water quality, just know that there's really two categories of health effects. There's acute effects. Those would be health effects seen within a short time of exposure to a particular contaminant. And examples of that would be things like bacterial viral contamination of water, or maybe things like salmonella or E. coli that we would associate with foodborne illnesses. Those are great examples of acute related health effects where shortly after being exposed to those pathogens, maybe a couple days or a week later, people might notice some sort of health complication, usually some sort of gastrointestinal illness or symptoms or disease. Then there's another category of health effect called chronic health effects. And these are oftentimes things that result from exposure to a substance over a really long or extended period of time. So if we're looking at things like arsenic or pesticides, we know that at certain concentrations, exposure to those contaminants in drinking water at certain levels over a long period of time will increase the risk of health complications later in life. But those are going to result from maybe years or decades of drinking that water. If we find things in our water at certain levels, drinking the water once or twice or for a short period of time is unlikely to cause health complications. But that being said, things like arsenic or pesticides in the water, if this is going to be your primary drinking water supply for years or decades while you're in the home, then there obviously is some incentive to try and reduce your exposure to those substances in the long term. But to put that into context, when we talk about chronic related health concerns, these things that we find in our water are only one of the overall risk that we face in our everyday life. So just to put those things into context, different risks, 1,000 people in each of these situations, 1,000 people, there's 0.16 out of 1,000 that would likely be struck by lightning in their lifetime. Indoor radon at certain levels combined with smoking, 1,000 people exposed to that condition at the end, we'd expect 32 out of 1,000 to develop, lung cancer at some point in their life from that environmental exposure. And if we look at something like arsenic in drinking water, at that level or above that level, 1,000 people exposed to that condition we would expect 3 out of 1,000 to develop, cancer maybe as a result of that environmental exposure. So the reason I point this out is that these risks, everybody's risk tolerance is a little bit different. So some people might look at 3 in 1,000 and say, that's not something I'm terribly concerned about. But other people might look at 3 in 1,000 and say, that's a level of risk that I'm not comfortable with. And I'm going to take additional steps to try and reduce my exposure to these substances. Finding some of these things in your water does not guarantee health complications, but it does increase the risk. And hopefully these examples give you some ability to try and interpret what those health-related drinking water standards might mean for something like arsenic or pesticides or maybe nitrate when it comes to older adults or populations outside of sensitive populations. And just highlighting too, there is a difference between public and private water supplies. Many people may have been on a public water supply at some point in time. Those water supplies are regularly tested, and if there's anything wrong, public water supplies are required to meet drinking water standards. Private wells are not required to be regularly tested. The fact that you participated in this program, is strictly voluntary. And if you did find anything wrong, based on your results, you are not required to take any sort of corrective action. We obviously are here to help you decide, should you so choose, what the corrective action might be, and help evaluate what those next steps might be. But we will not follow up with anybody to see what additional measures you might have taken. Really, the message of today is that you as a private well owner are your own water utility manager. It's really up to you to decide how often you want to test, what you want to test for, and what additional steps you might want to take should there be issues or problems. So transitioning into the results, if you did have your results received in the mail, you can take those out at this time. The first thing and probably the most important test to perform regularly on a private well is going to be the coliform bacteria test. Coliform bacteria are a measure of, is the well capable of producing bacteria-free water without treatment? And that's how we gauge if the well is providing sanitary water, is using this coliform bacteria test. Coliform bacteria on their own generally do not cause illness, but we don't expect to find coliform bacteria at significant numbers in groundwater. Significant amounts of coliform bacteria in groundwater somebody's well indicates a potential pathway for surface water and microorganisms, potentially, pathogenic organisms to enter somebody's well water system. So we use the coliform bacteria test to try and kind of ascertain whether a well is capable of providing sanitary water. And if we ever detect coliform bacteria in somebody's sample, we would also check to see if there's E. coli present. E. coli is a specific type of bacteria that we associate with human or animal fecal waste or human or animal waste. And that's obviously a much more dangerous situation if we find E. coli, because it provides confirmation that either human or animal waste is contaminating somebody's well water supply. And if E. coli is present, it's much more likely that we're going to find things like Salmonella, Campylobacter, Cryptosporidia, Giardia. Those are other microorganisms that are a little bit more complicated to test for, but would be likely in a water sample that was positive for E. coli. So these two tests, the coliform bacteria combined with the E. coli, are good screening tools to try and understand, is this well providing sanitary water, and is this a well that I want to rely on as a drinking water source? That's really the main goal of this set of tests right here. Sometimes when we find coliform bacteria in a well, a lot of times we're concerned about the well construction as being the source of that bacteria. So what you're seeing here is a picture of different wells. All of them tested positive for coliform bacteria with the exception of one. And it's not a kind of a trick question. The good looking well, or the bacteria free well, is the well on the upper, kind of the left, upper left. What you're seeing is a well that's got a vermin-proof cap. The casing extends about 12 to 14 inches above the land surface, which is what we like to see. The area around the well is maintained or relatively free and clear of obstruction. That's all really important because it allows us to observe that well, and it prevents things from concealing. You know, if we're concealing the well, it might provide concealment for things like rabbits or small rodents or insects to inhabit that area around the well, and those aren't necessarily things that we want living and kind of habitating directly around our water supply. The other pictures that you see show either structural faults or defects with, let's say, the construction of the well itself that would allow bacteria into somebody's well water system. So, you know, the upper right is just showing somebody's cap that had been cracked. And anytime it rains, this is the fall, so you see leaves around it. Anything that falls from the sky has the potential to fall into that well and carry with it bacteria that could cause a bacteria positive sample. The picture on the upper center was a well that had a cap, but it was not on securely. So you could just simply lift the cap off the well, and there was enough space for small insects to crawl in, and you can actually see some earwigs kind of on the inside of that casing, and E. coli bacteria even can live in the guts of things like earwigs. So that was an example of small insects that were basically carrying bacteria into the well, and we're responsible for this person's bacteria positive sample. There's other things like old dug wells that might exist on rural properties that could represent a contamination source into the aquifer, which might help explain a bacteria positive sample. But oftentimes when we see positive coliform bacterias, the first thing we want to do is have people evaluate the well construction itself to see if there's some sort of simple explanation for how that bacteria might be getting into somebody's water system. Other things to look for, I mentioned old unused wells. The dug well is kind of an extreme example, but any old well on the property that's no longer being used could represent a direct conduit for surface water into the aquifer. And it's really important, if there's wells on properties that aren't being used anymore, that we properly fill and seal them to avoid the potential for surface water to get in through that conduit, where it might pose an existing problem to contaminate our well moving forward. Other things to look for might be outbuildings or livestock waters or yard hydrants that don't have proper backflow prevention. Sometimes those might be obvious, other obvious sources for, you know, cross connections or back siphoning that could potentially contaminate somebody's well with bacteria. If those things don't work, then it might be the geology. If those things don't explain where the bacteria are coming from, it might be the geology itself that is partially responsible for the sensitivity of a well to, let's say, bacterial contamination. And I really like this picture because it's indicative of many areas in the southwestern part of Wisconsin where we might have very thin soils overlying cracked or fractured carbonate rock. And in this case, this is kind of an extreme example of a sinkhole where water from that sinkhole is infiltrating down into the rock. And here we have a well that is cased just to the top of the water table. So we see the total well depth, but then we have the casing depth, which is also important for understanding where our well water comes from. In this example, the casing again extends just to the top of the water table. And what that means is that the whole section of the well that's exposed to the water table is basically receiving water from that whole cross section or whole aerial extent of that well. And water from that sinkhole has kind of a direct pathway into this particular well water or well water system. If we were to deepen that casing or extend that casing further into our aquifer, we've sealed off that upper portion of the aquifer. It doesn't mean that water from that sinkhole can't contaminate this well, but that water is going to have a much harder time or a longer flow path to get down deep into the aquifer where this current well configuration would be receiving its water from. So this diagram does a really good job of helping illustrate how certain geology might make an area more vulnerable to bacterial contamination, but also the role of well casing and well depth in determining where somebody's well water might be originating from. And in those situations, it might be the geology or the construction of the well that makes it vulnerable to bacterial contamination. If we ever do have positive coliform bacteria tests, we do encourage people to retest as kind of the first step. That initial test that we do is just a present absent test. On an initial positive or present bacteria, the retest we'd encourage people to do, we'd want them to follow up with what we call a bacterial count. That count would give you an indication of how many bacteria are actually present. If it's 1 or 2 bacteria, it might be something that could be handled really easily with just a simple well disinfection. If it's hundreds or thousands of bacteria, it might indicate, something more structurally wrong with the well that needs to be corrected or fixed before you could reasonably be assured of getting a bacteria-free sample. So again, upon an initial coliform bacteria positive, retesting is that first step. And retesting with a bacterial count could provide some additional information to help you understand what those next steps might be. For reoccurring bacteria problems, if this is something you're testing for annually, and every year you're having to deal with bacteria in a well, it might be important to evaluate whether or not a different well configuration or a new well might help solve or address the issue. It'd be great if wells could last forever, but they do probably over time start to develop issues or problems. And older wells just weren't constructed with, let's say, the same kind of materials or considerations for water safety that more modern wells, and by modern I mean probably within the last 30 or 40 years, is what I would consider to be kind of a modern style well. Next, we'll transition into some of the other analytes. We won't go through all of them in as much detail as bacteria, but I do want to kind of highlight what some of these mean in hopes that it'll answer some of the questions that you might have about specific results. And the first of these being hardness. Hardness is one of the more common aesthetic problems that people in Wisconsin have to deal with. It's naturally occurring, coming from calcium and magnesium that we find in the various rocks or soils that water moves through. No health considerations with hardness, but is associated with maybe scaling on fixtures, soap scum. People with hard water tend to use more detergent. It might etch dishes over time. And hard water is what we consider, hard water is water with greater than 200 milligrams per liter of hardness measured as calcium carbonate. There is this kind of ideal range of hardness between about 100 and 200. And then there is a situation where there's too little hardness, and we call that soft water, where water that's soft tends to be a little bit more corrosive or aggressive. If we look at the results for these 4 areas, again, what you're seeing is a map of the results. the different colors represent the different concentrations of hardness that were measured. In the vast majority, we're looking at more than 75% of the results that were analyzed are greater than 200 milligrams per liter and would be considered to be hard water. A few samples that were really low levels, but obviously you can see if you have hard water, chances are pretty good that your neighbors are dealing with the same or similar issues. The one solution that many people turn to if they have hard water is going to be water softeners. And water softeners are kind of tried and true technology to treat or counteract the negative effects that result from calcium and magnesium in the water. The only negative to water softening is that it increases sodium content of water. The amount of sodium that's added is probably not going to be an issue for most people. But if your doctor says, you should really limit your sodium intake, then drinking softened water might not be the best option for you. And that's one reason why many people will actually bypass their primary drinking water faucet from the softening process, is that they either don't want the additional sodium or they actually just prefer the taste of the unsoftened water, but don't want to deal with the other negative impacts with, let's say, laundry or bathing or showering. But that's, a lot of times people's plumbing systems, if they haven't inspected them very carefully, they might not realize that the cold water kitchen faucet is unsoftened. Other things to point out about the hardness value: if your hardness value says, anything less than 10 or less than 4, chances are really good that that's a softened sample. And it's not an accurate representation of your actual hardness, but it does provide confirmation maybe that your water softener is operating efficiently or operating up to standards. If we look at some of the other tests in that homeowner package, things like alkalinity, conductivity, and pH are overall water quality tests that we can use to measure or understand how corrosive that water might be, or what the likelihood of that water to, let's say, form scale on fixtures or on plumbing is going to be. So things to point out, just highlight about alkalinity. Usually alkalinity is roughly equal to the hardness concentration in an unsoftened sample. So if you did happen to submit a softened sample and your hardness value is really low, you can get a sense for what your actual hardness is by looking at your alkalinity value. Again, those should be roughly equal in an unsoftened sample. Conductivity just measures the amount of total ions. Usually this is about twice the hardness value, because the bulk of ions in water are going to be calcium and magnesium. If the conductivity value is much greater than twice the hardness, then we're probably going to see elevated chloride or sodium or sulfite in that water sample. So that conductivity is just an easy way to kind of track water quality. It's a fairly inexpensive test to run. Oftentimes there's sensors, water sensors, that you can get relatively cheaply or inexpensively at a store or online. So conductivity, is a pretty simple way, just overall water quality monitoring tool to help us understand or track changes in water quality at a more frequent scale than what we might be testing for on, let's say, an annual test. And then lastly, pH. Most people are familiar with pH. We know that things like lemon juice are acidic. Things like soap tend to be basic. Normal pH in Wisconsin is anywhere between 6 and 9. That's just something we do, again, to understand the ability of water to either corrode or scale. So those 3 previous tests we combine into a calculation that gives us the saturation index. And negative values would mean the water is going to be more corrosive. And the greater the positive number is, the greater the ability of that water to form scale, and probably the more beneficial a water softener would be, especially as you increment up on the positive end of that saturation index. So that's really the main intent of those sets of analyses in that homeowner package. And then other things in that homeowner package are things like nitrate and chloride that have to deal with land use impacts. So nitrate is something that has health effects associated with it. Next to bacteria, it's probably the second most important test to perform regularly on a private well. One, because of those health impacts, but two, it's an excellent indicator of land use impacts and gives us some ability to track changes in land use over time. The health effects related to nitrate are immediately a concern to infants less than 6 months of age because of a condition called methemoglobinemia. Common name is blue baby disease, or pregnant women or women who may become pregnant because of links to things like birth defects or miscarriages, not only in humans, but also in livestock. So if there are sensitive populations, infants less than 6 months of age, or women who are or may become pregnant, we would not want them drinking water above the drinking water standard. And then for all populations, we would want people to avoid long-term consumption of nitrate above certain levels. And what those certain levels might be would be 10 milligrams per liter. So that's what we consider to be the safe drinking water limit. Above that limit, municipalities, public water systems would be required to treat their water or find some sort of alternative water source in order to ensure the safety of people in that community. And we use that limit as kind of guidance for private well owners to help them understand whether they might benefit from additional treatment or additional investigation into their well water quality. Again, the other thing I mentioned is that we can use the nitrate level to understand the degree to which human activities are impacting our groundwater, our well water. Natural levels of nitrate in groundwater we would expect to be less than 2. So levels greater than that, tell us that the surrounding land use is having some influence on our well water quality. And nitrate is going to come primarily from agricultural sources, but can also originate from things like septic system drain fields or maybe lawn fertilizer activity nearby. If we look at the nitrate results, what we'd see is that 60% or so are in that less than 5 range. There's about 40% which are in that less than 2 or natural or background level. And for this part of the state, this is actually quite good. This is better than we'd see in even other parts of Greene County for 40% of the results to be in that kind of background or natural level. Somewhat concerning is that there are about 5% of wells that did exceed that nitrate drinking water standard. And even though there are 5%, that is still better than the statewide average. We would expect about 1 in 10 wells statewide to exceed the drinking water standard for nitrate. So there is, some reason to be, monitoring and to be concerned about nitrate in Greene County. It's important to test for. The good news is that the vast majority of people in this northwestern part of the county, generally have water that meets or exceeds, and by exceed, I mean is safe to drink with respect to nitrate. If we look at the land use of Greene County, one reason why this part of the county tends to be a little bit better with respect to nitrate is just the diversity of the land use is a little bit more diverse, meaning there's more grassland or shrubland, there's more forest on the landscape, and that tends to dilute or offset some of the impacts of the agricultural activity that might be occurring. It's important to point out that regardless of how well we're farming, there's no agricultural system that's 100% efficient at holding on to the nitrogen fertilizer or animal waste that we might be using to supply those nutrients to crops. So in agricultural areas, it's not surprising to find elevated levels of nitrate, even in those areas where farmers are doing things exactly as we would recommend or want them to. Obviously, not following recommendations or overusing things like fertilizer would exacerbate those issues. But even in areas where we are farming optimally, it's unfortunate that we still will be dealing with nitrate to some extent, depending on the soils or the geology, which can help to offset or mitigate some of the severity or the magnitude of how much nitrate ends up in our wells or in our groundwater system. If we do have elevated nitrate in a well, ideally we'd want to look at eliminating the source of that contamination, but that might not be possible. Even if it was possible, because we controlled that area, it might take years or decades to notice measurable improvement in somebody's well. So oftentimes we're looking at short-term solutions. I oftentimes say that looking at changing the well depth or constructing a new well might be a possibility, but it's also kind of a really expensive experiment. If the well is providing bacteria-free or sanitary water, drilling a new well for nitrate might not be your best option. Oftentimes people that are dealing with nitrate, the most cost-effective solutions might be to look at bottled water for the drinking water, or maybe some sort of water treatment device that treats enough water for drinking and cooking. Because nitrate is only a drinking water concern, we're not concerned about the nitrate for things like bathing or washing dishes or doing our laundry. Because it's only a drinking water concern, oftentimes we can get by with water treatment that might treat a couple gallons to 10 gallons per day, which is going to provide us enough water for drinking and cooking. But the rest of the water would be left untreated, given that this is primarily a drinking water concern. Another one related to land use is going to be chloride. Chloride is very similar to nitrate in that we don't expect to find much in our groundwater. Less than 10 is considered to be kind of natural levels. Anything greater than that may indicate impact from fertilizer use, septic systems again, or even road salting activities from the winter, oftentimes may be responsible for elevated chloride levels. So it's not surprising to see some of the highest chloride concentrations near more urban areas or near major kind of highways or roadways because of the influence or impacts from what we do during the winter months with respect to our roads. So here's the map of chloride. Again, the different colors correspond to different concentrations. 40%, which is very similar to our nitrate results. And if we looked at the nitrate results, we'd probably see a lot of the low values for nitrate correspond with the low values for chloride. Those areas where we do find elevated chloride, again, it's not surprising to see some of the highest concentrations, the oranges and the greens, kind of in areas where we might have a greater density of people on private well and septic systems, or we might find greater densities of roads, driveways, parking lots that are receiving road salt in the winter months. None of these concentrations are extremely high to where we'd notice kind of any aesthetic concerns because of the chloride, but definitely something to continue to monitor and keep an eye on to see, how land use activities might be impacting chloride levels moving into the future. Next, I'm not going to cover all the metals. Some people chose to have a metals package run. And again, I'm not going to cover all of them, but I do want to highlight the ones that are probably most critical. And arsenic is one test that, similar to bacteria and nitrate, we would recommend every well be tested for arsenic at least once. You see a map on the right of Wisconsin arsenic concentrations. The areas without any color are areas where we don't have sufficient data, but all the other areas are showing kind of the average, or it actually shows the maximum concentration of arsenic in any given town. And Greene County isn't, it's definitely not the place where we notice the highest concentrations, but it is an area where we found arsenic in the past. So it is a good idea for every well to test for arsenic at least once. When we find arsenic, it's really important to point out that it would be from naturally occurring mineral deposits in the soil or the bedrock that our wells are constructed into. The standard for arsenic is quite small, 0.010 milligrams per liter. Some labs might report it as 10 parts per billion. Health effects are related to chronic exposure. So finding arsenic in your water, if you're using that water for drinking, not an immediate concern, but there's definitely some incentive to try and reduce your exposure to arsenic long-term because of increased risk of things like cancer from long-term exposure to that in somebody's drinking water supply. If we look at the arsenic results from this program, the vast majority were below the standard. There were about 33% that we didn't detect any arsenic. There were about 66% that detected small levels, but we would generally consider them to be suitable. It's rare to analyze a sample and not find any arsenic. We generally oftentimes do find very small levels in all groundwater sources. When it gets above that 0.010 milligram per liter range, however, that's where we would urge some maybe additional steps for those folks. And there was one sample. My guess is the reason we don't see it on the map is because it was in one of those sections where we received multiple samples, and we're seeing the average, which dilutes out the concentration a little bit. But if you did detect above that drinking water standard, there's some incentive to maybe follow up with an additional arsenic test at some point in the next 6 months or so, just to see or confirm that initial arsenic positive or arsenic level that you might have analyzed for. Other things in that metals package, iron. This is probably the most common aesthetic complaint that people have with well water. Iron is naturally occurring. It's not necessarily a health concern. In fact, most people might benefit from a little bit more iron in their diets, but it does cause staining on fixtures, maybe staining of laundry. And for that reason, it can be problematic at levels greater than about 0.3 milligrams per liter is going to be when it's going to be more noticeable for these aesthetic issues or problems. And elevated levels of iron would make it more likely for what we call iron bacteria. That's a different type of bacteria than the coliform bacteria, but one that causes kind of maybe an oily sheen on the water. It might cause kind of a sliminess to the water, especially noticeable on maybe the inside of the toilet tank. And those problems can be mitigated through periodic well disinfection, but could be, obviously exacerbated by the level of iron found in somebody's well. Other issues that people might have with their water test results could be copper. There is a safe drinking water level of 1.3 milligrams per liter for copper. We want to generally see levels less than that if we're going to be drinking that water. Copper doesn't have very serious health complications, but can cause some minor discomfort in people that aren't used to drinking water with elevated levels of copper. And again, the source of that copper isn't going to be the groundwater or the land use, it's going to be the plumbing system itself that's largely responsible for elevated copper. Similar to copper is going to be lead, in that the lead originates from plumbing systems. So prior to 1985, lead solder was primarily used to join copper pipes or copper plumbing. Brass also contains lead. So if you had an elevated lead sample and you took it from maybe the pressure tank in the basement, that oftentimes is brass, you might notice an elevated lead level as a result of where you took that particular sample. Lead, the standard, similar to arsenic, is very small, 0.015 milligrams per liter, or 15 parts per billion, depending on how the lab reports it, because there's no known benefits to lead in the human body. And children in particular are vulnerable to the effects of lead. And there's a picture of a child drinking out of a hose. One thing that we might not often realize is that, a lot of plastics or rubber components do also contain lead. So drinking out of hoses is also something that we want to discourage people, especially children, from doing, because if we think of that hose baking in the sun on a hot summer day, that's going to degrade that material and maybe make lead, if it's a component of that material, even more soluble. So for those reasons, there's some precautions that we can take if we find lead in our plumbing systems to avoid exposure. And the one with hoses is easy. Try to avoid drinking water directly out of a hose. But if we have lead and copper and we suspect it's coming from the plumbing system itself, that lead and copper result is often elevated in water that sits in contact with that plumbing system for a long or extended period of time. And we instructed people for that metals test to take the water sample first thing in the morning after that water sat in contact with the plumbing for a long or extended period of time. And that gives us kind of a worst case scenario of lead and copper. If we let that water run for a minute or two and we flush that water that's been sitting in contact with our plumbing, if we flush that water out, we're greatly going to reduce the amount of lead and copper. And anytime that I've seen elevated lead and copper and allowed that water system to flush out sufficiently, we've always been able to reduce those lead and copper levels to undetectable levels. So we know that, even though lead and copper can be health problems or problematic for health, there's a relatively simple solution to reduce exposure to those elements in private wells, and that's simply to let the water run for a minute or two if you're going to be using that water for drinking or cooking. And then lastly, those are the metals I wanted to highlight. There's additional information on the other metals and maybe the interpretive guides that accompany your samples, and I can certainly take questions after the official presentation ends about metals that you might have questions about. But in addition to the homeowner package and that metals package, we also offered what we call the DACT, or the DAC screen. And that particular test is looking at pesticides. There's literally, dozens, if not hundreds of pesticides that might be used in agricultural settings throughout the state or throughout the country. And each one might have various health standards associated with it. Looking for all those pesticides, looking to analyze all those pesticides would be really costly for the average homeowner. And some we might not even have analytical capabilities to look for at this point in time. So we use kind of information that is collected by the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection, which periodically checks groundwater throughout the state of Wisconsin. And their reporting, their testing shows that the most frequently detected pesticides in Wisconsin's groundwater are compounds called allachlor, metolachlor, and atrazine. And that DAC screen is very specific for atrazine type compounds or pesticides. Specifically a breakdown component of atrazine type pesticides, which is going to be more commonly found in groundwater. So atrazine is the parent compound. It can break down into various metabolites, one of them being DACT, or diaminochlorotriazine. And that one, because it tends to be more prominent in groundwater, that's the one we've chosen to look for as kind of a screening tool And the other reason it's a great screening tool is when we find pesticides above drinking water standards, the one we most frequently expect to find above drinking water standards is going to be atrazine or breakdown components of atrazine. So for that reason, DACT is kind of our go-to screening tool for pesticides. It's a fairly inexpensive screening tool to help people understand if pesticides in their well water is, one, something to be concerned about, and two, if they find significant levels, does it warrant additional investigation or follow-up testing? What we see, this is just a screen, again, highlighting what that DAC screen is looking for. The drinking water limit or level is 3 parts per billion. And if we look at the results from this program, of the just over 100 so people that had the DAC screen performed, 80% of them showed no detect, which is great. This is even lower than or higher in terms of the amount of kind of natural levels that we would expect to see, that we saw with respect to kind of the nitrate and the chloride levels. 80% of the DAC results are kind of showing natural or background levels. There's about 16% that showed some minor, less than 0.3 UG or parts per billion of DACT. And then there were about 5 samples that detected, somewhat higher concentrations, but none of the samples exceeded what we would consider to be the drinking water standard with respect to atrazine type compounds. If we look to see where those higher levels occurred, oftentimes we'd see that those samples that contain DACT would also likely contain elevated nitrate as well. And that would be expected in areas of agricultural activity, because this is primarily, again, a pesticide used on corn production. So with that, where do we go from here? There are some recommended next steps. I know Greene County offers voluntary testing every few years as they rotate around the state. So if Greene County continues well testing, I would expect maybe in 3 to 4 years for them to come back to this part of the county again. In the meantime, there are ways that you can test more frequently for things like bacteria or maybe nitrate if it were elevated. Those are tests that we'd oftentimes recommend annually for private well owners. If you have not checked for arsenic, that may be something else to consider in the next few years or next time that extension offers this program. Because again, every well we'd encourage to test for arsenic at least once. And if your arsenic level was present, especially if it was present above that safe drinking water level, you might consider testing again in 15 months or so, just to see if those levels have changed significantly. And if so, there might be some additional steps, things like water treatment, that you'd consider to avoid long-term consumption or exposure to arsenic. And if you haven't had that pesticide or that DAC screen performed, particularly if your nitrate level was greater than 5, that might be something else to consider at some point in the future, just to give you some additional information on your well water quality. So with that, I'd like to conclude the formal portion of this presentation. Before I do, I'd like to definitely thank our sponsors, Greene County Extension Office, as well as the towns of Adams, New Glarus, York, and Washington, for allowing the programs to move forward and helping to support through their efforts, offering this program to town residents. And you'll see my contact information listed. If anybody does have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. My phone number is there, or email is provided as well. I will definitely do my best to try and follow up with any questions that people have that they might not have gotten answered in the formal part of the presentation. So thanks, everybody, and I'll turn it over to Victoria for some concluding remarks.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Kevin. I do just want to say, so if you want to test again, tests are always available through the Greene County Public Health Department. Extension Greene County does do an annual drinking water testing, and we intentionally reach out to the different towns that are rotating around. So there, you always have lots of options when it comes to testing. So that's definitely always available. And we are so fortunate that we have extension water specialists, and they're always available for questions. So Kevin and Joe are awesome. We are so fortunate. With that, I'm going to stop recording.